morning. I'm Shani Pierre. I'm the director of the Maison Française at Columbia University, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this discussion of Tyler Stovall's book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea. This event is being presented by the Maison Française, as well as the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, the Department of History, and the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center of the Humanities. We will keep this discussion to about an hour, and we'll save some time towards the end for questions from the audience. So if you'd like to pose a question anytime in French or English, you can do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And today's discussion will also be recorded and posted on our website. So I'd like to thank Tyler Stovall for your patience in joining us on this rescheduled date to talk about your book, and thank Brent Edwards and Bob Gooding-Williams for joining us as discussants. And Madeleine Dobie, my colleague, who's the chair of the French department, and she will be moderating, beginning with a proper introduction of our guests. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shani, and thanks to the Maison Française for hosting this discussion of White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea by Tyler Stovall, which has just come out with Princeton University Press. In this book, Tyler Stovall makes the strong case that slavery, colonialism, and racism have not, as is often suggested, been contradictions or exceptions to the principle of freedom that has been a guiding force in modern world history, but rather integral dimensions of this ideal. Since the late 18th century, Stovall argues to be white has often meant to be free, and to be free has meant to be white. White freedom is a sweeping study that covers more than 2 centuries, from the late Enlightenment to the dawn of the 21st century. It focuses on the United States and France, 2 republics whose identities have been closely tied to the idea of liberty, but it also touches on other world contexts and explores global interconnections. The book grapples with such macro-level concepts as liberty, liberalism, republicanism, democracy, slavery, segregation, imperialism, and fascism. But it also presents fascinating close readings of cultural artifacts ranging from the Statue of Liberty to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. As I hope this suggests, White Freedom is an ambitious and absorbing book. And I'm very excited to be moderating this conversation between its author, Tyler Stovall, and my Columbia colleagues, Brent Edwards and Bob Gooding-Williams. As Shani mentioned, this event was originally scheduled for mid-April, and it was postponed in solidarity with the strike by the graduate workers of Columbia. It seems quite fitting that it's been rescheduled for today, May 10th, the National Day of Memory of the Slave Trade, Slavery, and its abolition in France. So I'm going to briefly introduce the 3 presenters, and then I'll hand over to Tyler Stovall, who'll talk about the book for about 15 minutes. After which Bob and then Brent will each offer their own reflections. After Tyler's had an opportunity to respond, the floor will be open to questions. And as Shani mentioned, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please just drop it in the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And you can do that at any point. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tyler Stovall, who's the Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Fordham University. Tyler Stovall is an eminent historian of modern France, whose seminal work on colonial and transnational dynamics has played an important role in reshaping the field of French history. A past president of the American Historical Association, he is the author of many books and edited volumes, including The Rise of the Paris Red Belt, Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, and Paris and Transnational France, The Modern History of a Universal Nation. He's also the co-editor of the volumes Identity in Question, Nationalism, Colonialism, and Race, and The Color of Liberty, Histories of Race in France. Bob Gooding-Williams is professor of African American Studies and Philosophy at Columbia, and he was the founding director of the Center for Race, Philosophy, and Social Justice. His areas of specialization include social and political philosophy, especially anti-racist critical theory, the history of African American political thought, 19th century European philosophy, and aesthetics. His books include Zarathustra's Dionysian Modernism, Look, a Negro, Philosophical Essays on Race, Culture, and Politics, and In the Shadow of Du Bois, Afro-Modern Political Thought in America. Brent Hayes Edwards is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. He's a specialist of African American and African diaspora culture, translation studies, and jazz studies, and the author of Epistrophes, Jazz and the Literary Imagination, and the Practice of Diaspora, Literature, Translation, and the Rise of Black Internationalism. He has also published scholarly editions of such key works as Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, and he is the translator of Michel Leiris's L'Afrique Fantôme. So White Freedom is a book written by a historian. The fact that our panel this evening includes a philosopher and a scholar of literature and music speaks, I think, to its broad scope and immersion in several different disciplines and methodologies. So now welcome, Tyler. I think I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Madeleine, for that very kind and generous introduction. I just want to say a few words about how this book came to be and what I hope to accomplish with it. So, as you pointed out, I was trained as a historian, as a labor historian, as a matter of fact, of France. And then I gradually became interested in the comparisons between France and the United States, especially around race. And ultimately, what we've chosen to call transnational history, history that looks at not the absence of the nation state, but rather the ways in which the nation state is both part of a larger whole and how it, in its smaller details, reflects those greater global presences. And I've had a variety of different reasons for writing the books that I have, but this one was distinctive because it was a book that I felt I had to write because it simply wouldn't leave me alone. That I ended up thinking about it at night, that the questions that it involved were really absorbing and ultimately troubling to me. So I figured the best way to exercise something like that is to sit down and write it out, and that's what I did. Let me talk about a couple of things that I really wanted to look at in this book. First of all was the idea that there was a central contradiction in the history of the modern Western world, especially of countries like France and the United States. On the one hand, they are seen as countries that stand for freedom, for whose history is ultimately centered around the growth of freedom. And yet, on the other hand, they also represent some of the most dramatic examples of the lack of freedom. So my book starts out with, for example, a quotation from the Declaration of Independence for the United States and France's Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Declaration of Independence was written by a people that called for freedom while they were also holding a very large slave population. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was written by a nation that at the time owned the most profitable slave colony, Saint-Domingue, the world had ever seen. What intrigued me was that this distinction had often been viewed as a contradiction. And I thought in some ways that makes sense, but in some ways I have a problem with arguing that people ultimately are always engaged in things that go against each other. If people are engaged in a practice or practices over decades and centuries, there must be some kind of inner unity, inner rationality to those practices. And so I decided I wanted to find out what was the reason, or how do you get beyond the idea of a contradiction between race and freedom? And I thought that you do that by seeing what people have to say themselves about freedom and how they conceive of it for themselves and for others. And ultimately, it seemed to me that it was all about defining freedom in racial terms. That, in other words, freedom was part and parcel of a racial superiority complex, in effect. To be free was to be white, and ultimately then to be white was to be free. And one of the things that fascinated me about this was this seemed to be true not just in the 18th century, but it remains true down to the present day. One of the most conservative groups of congressmen in America today, for example, is the House Freedom Caucus, which is also a virtually all-white body and very conservative and at times very racist. So I was really interested to see how these ideas went together. The incident, if more than anything else, that really sparked me to get started with this was the incident I described at the very beginning of the book. The discussion around the House of Representatives, the Congressional house and the ways in which it was built in part by slave labor. And the idea that a building has often been referred to as the Temple of Liberty, for example, the idea that that building was built by slave labor was pretty striking. But what was especially striking to me was what happened when people decided to address that contradiction. When it was discovered that the Capitol building was built by slave labor, members of both the Republican and Democratic parties, and one of the few examples of inter-party cooperation that's existed recently, decided to have create a memorial to rename part of the building Emancipation Hall as a way of honoring the slaves whose labor had built it. And I thought in some ways that's a really wonderful story, but in some ways it's also a very strange story, because it seemed to me, why would you call a building that was built by slave labor Emancipation Hall as a way of honoring the slaves that built it? Those slaves were certainly not emancipated. Very few of them probably ever lived to see emancipation. If you really wanted to honor them, why not simply call it Slave Hall? And why would it be impossible to name the Capitol building Slave Hall, or at least a part of it Slave Hall, or the slave quarters, so on and so forth? So that got me thinking about, so how do you sort of reconcile these kinds of issues, and set me off on a very long search across two nations and across 2 centuries of world history to explore that. Let me just say a word about my choice of France and America. Partly it was, of course, natural. I was trained as a French historian, was born and raised in America. In fact, born and raised in a town that was actually founded by French emigres from the French Revolution who were in search of freedom in America. So in a sense, I was sort of born to this, right? But it's also true that probably no other nations in the world have ingrained the idea of freedom so much into their national identities as have France and the United States. For both countries, and it is part of their universalistic vision of their nationalism, both countries regard being free as the essence of their national characters. And so it seemed to me these were countries that were most important to look at in terms of considering this nature of freedom and its relationship to race. I was also interested in looking at the ways in which ideas of both freedom and race, or racism, have changed over time, of looking at the ways in which freedom was not always seen as positive and racism was not always seen as negative. So for example, in terms of freedom, all you have to do to look at negative images of freedom is substitute the words anarchism, for example, or libertinage, or others that suggest lack of control. And freedom also all of a sudden becomes very dangerous. Similarly with race, there's ways in which you could look at race as talking about racial solidarity and achievement, and all of a sudden becomes very positive. So part of this history I was interested in exploring was the way in which these ideas shifted. And I was also very interested in exploring how modern notions of freedom involve suppressing other ideas of freedom. So the first chapter of the book begins with a discussion of 2 types of freedom that had to be suppressed. One is the freedom of pirates, and one is the freedom of children. Pirates have to be suppressed because they are a danger to commerce. The freedom of children has to be suppressed by making them grow up. And so one is an act of hate, in effect, one is an act of love, but they both lead to the same point, that there's only certain types of freedom that can be tolerated, and the ways in which these types of freedom are racialized is also interesting to me. So I was very interested in this process of not just building freedom, but building freedom in a certain kind of way. And time again, when I looked at that process, it seemed to me that choices about freedom involved also choices about race, or were shaped by choices about race. That ultimately freedom had to be white, in the modern era at least, to become truly worthy of being freedom. And let me just end up by talking about the latter stages of the book in the 20th century and ultimately the 21st century. Because it seemed to me, and looking at the history of freedom, there is white freedom, but there are also other visions of freedom that are universal, that have defined and structured the struggles most notably the civil rights movement, the struggle for decolonization, that have called for freedom being stripped of its racial exclusiveness and being applied to all women and men. And one of the most interesting things I found was looking at this struggle, that it was by no means a complete, fully fledged struggle. If you look at, for example, the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement certainly had its triumphs, but it also had its failures. One of the things I'm very interested in, for example, in terms of the latter, is the failure of school integration in America. In many ways, American schools are almost as segregated as they've ever been after over 50 years of seeing school integration as a symbol of extension of freedom to all peoples. So the idea that there is a narrative that is ultimately triumphalist of the birth, of the overcoming of racial visions of freedom by a universal vision of freedom, I'm afraid is really not quite borne out by our recent history and even by our present day. And so it seems to me this is a story that will continue beyond my time, unfortunately. But then that will be for another historian to write up. So let me leave it at that.
Thanks, Tyler. Bob?
Great, thank you. Well, first, thanks for the book. I think it's a terrific book, and I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so, maybe 9, saying why I think it's a terrific book. Okay. So Professor Stovall's book is an original and insightful contribution to our understanding both of the history of Western concepts of freedom since the Enlightenment and of the role of race thinking in the articulation and implementation of those concepts. I begin with 2 quotations from the introduction to Stovall's book, which I invoke to sketch what I take to be the general trajectory of his argument. I then turn to a couple of his examples, one of which he's already mentioned actually, and I conclude finally with 2 questions. So the first quotation is part of Stovall's answer to the objection that by interpreting freedom as a racist ideology, he overlooks the fact that participants in struggles against racism have understood themselves to be freedom fighters. Against this objection, Stovall agrees that, and I'm quoting now, many great popular struggles have been waged in the modern era to bring freedom to all men and women. But in many ways, that is my point. People of color had to fight for inclusion into the idea of freedom. In fact, not just struggling to be part of white freedom, but to overthrow it as a concept and as a social and political reality. And I want to emphasize that last phrase, to overthrow it as a concept and as a social and political reality. I'll be coming back to that. In the second quotation, Stovall makes it clear that he intends his book, quote, not to argue that white freedom is the only kind of freedom, or to argue that all modern versions of liberty are racist. Still, he says, his book suggests that belief in freedom was a key component of white supremacy. I'm still quoting here. In societies governed by racial hierarchy, the whiter one was, the more free one was. So taken together, these quotations point, I think, to 3 theses that go to the heart of Stovall's larger argument. So the first thesis, as I read it, is that struggles to dismantle racial hierarchy have been at once struggles to free Blacks from racial oppression and struggles to challenge the racialized concepts of freedom that have functioned to justify racial hierarchy. The second thesis follows from the first, specifically that anti-racist struggles to free Blacks have pivoted around non-racist concepts of freedom, according to which being white is not by definition essential to being free, as well as racist concepts of freedom, according to which being white is by definition essential to being free. Anti-racist struggles have invoked non-racist conceptions of freedom when they have imagined worlds in which Blacks and other non-whites were free, worlds in which being Black did not count against the possibility of being free. At the same time, anti-racist struggles have questioned racist conceptions of freedom that have defined freedom as essentially white, as white freedom, thus as inaccessible to Blacks in principle, precisely in order to challenge the use of these conceptions to justify, to rationalize racial hierarchy. Gayatri Spivak has aptly characterized the post-colonial as inhabiting a double bind in regard to the Enlightenment, suggesting that she learned to use the European Enlightenment from below, at once resisting and accommodating what comes from it. As I read Stovall, he suggests that Black freedom dreams, to borrow Robin Kelly's locution, have similarly inhabited a double bind, resisting the inherited Enlightenment tendency to interpret the phrase Black freedom as an oxymoron, while reinterpreting that phrase to express more inclusive, what he's called universalistic conceptualizations of Enlightenment liberty talk. The third thesis generalizes the implications of the first two, stating that for an historian properly to understand political contests over racial hierarchy, including both struggles against racial hierarchy and ongoing efforts to prop it up, they must understand those contests. The historian must understand those contests, not only as fights over the organization of our practices, again, what Stovall calls social and political reality, but just as importantly as fights over the conceptual framing of our participation in those practices. Ultimately, however, it is likely a mistake to draw too sharp a distinction between these two types of political contests. For as the philosopher Sally Haslanger has argued, our practices are constituted in part by the concepts in terms of which we enact them. Let me turn now to some examples, that is, to some particular cases that exemplify Stovall's argument. My first example is his discussion of the concept of savage freedom, to which he was alluding a moment or two ago. Summarizing his discussion, he writes, in essence, in the modern world, pirates and children have at times stood for a vision of liberty that not only challenges and departs from liberal orthodoxy, but is also racialized as other, a kind of Black or savage freedom. In the case of piracy, the decline of such savage freedom in the Caribbean and of white slavery in the Barbary Coast coincided with the rise of transatlantic slavery, and Black slavery, he said, had as its inevitable opposite white freedom. In the case of children, the embrace of savagery and non-white cultures represented their immaturity and their need to grow into a white model of liberty. Stovall continues, such alternate visions of freedom were both threatening and alluring at the same time, thus doubly dangerous. The continuing attraction of primitivism in Western culture illustrates the enduring appeal of savage freedom. The project of translating liberal ideas of freedom into the institutional framework of liberal democracy involves suppressing such alternate ideas of liberty, of in effect rendering them other. The increasingly powerful template of racial difference in the modern era provided an influential way of doing so. Ultimately, the antidote to savage freedom was the antidote to savage liberty was white freedom. That's the end of the quotation. So again, it's important to Stovall's argument that there exist alternate notions of freedom. Here in the passage I quoted, alternate visions of liberty. Setting aside Stovall's references to children, I stress his proposal that with the triumph of the Caribbean plantation economy, and later with the French conquest of Algeria, the suppression of piracy of what had been interpreted as a worldly manifestation of a savage and Black freedom went hand in hand with the suppression of the very concept of a savage and Black freedom on which that interpretation depended. Here, in other words, we have a case where the effort to establish and maintain racial hierarchy involved an ideological maneuver, the point of which was to deny that a vision or representation of liberty as something savage and Black was in fact a representation of liberty. Or to put the point differently, to assert that a vision of liberty as something savage and Black, while putatively representing an alternative to the liberal conception of freedom, represented no alternative at all, for it is in the nature of liberty to exclude Blackness and to require whiteness. It is this ideological maneuver that I take Stovall to have in mind when he writes that the antidote to savage liberty was white freedom. Stovall makes a similar point in his discussion of Emily Bronte's depiction of Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. The implication of that depiction, he maintains, is that Black freedom is no freedom at all. A second example is Stovall's treatment of the Haitian Revolution. Here he builds on the work of Michel Rolfe Tuyot, who argues that in the eyes of the West, the Haitian Revolution constituted an unthinkable history. To Tuyot's insight, Stovall adds that the struggle of Black slaves was unthinkable at the time and for a long time since, because it lay outside the bounds of white freedom. Stovall's point, I take it, is that the ideological conceptualization of freedom as essentially white had become so fundamentally entrenched by the end of the 18th century that it was impossible for white Western Europeans to regard the Haitian Revolution as a successful struggle for freedom. By then, it seems that, here I'm going to quote Stovall again, talk of Black freedom could only be heard as talk of a political and conceptual impossibility. I conclude with two questions. So the first is this: in writing White Freedom, Professor Stovall, did you intend to sketch a method for studying the racialization of concepts other than that of freedom? Consider, for example, the notion of valuable life, of life that matters. When Black Lives Matter activists assert that Black lives matter, I take them to be imagining a world in which it would be conceptually possible both to be Black and to have a life that matters. At the same time, I take them to be questioning racist conceptions of life that matters, which conceptions define valuable life as essentially white, as white life that matters, thus as life that is not Black, precisely in order to challenge the use of these conceptions to justify, to rationalize police violence. So the same line of argument I'm suggesting might be made in that case. The second question similarly relates to current events, and it draws inspiration from your discussion of the right to vote, or what you call the white to vote. And the question is this: does the concept of white freedom provide a useful point of reference for analyzing recent efforts to restrict and rationalize non-whites' exercise of the franchise? If so, I'm hoping that you will say something as to how such an analysis might proceed. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to hand over to Brent and just remind everyone that if you want to put a question or comment in the Q&A, you can do so now or later as you wish.
Thanks, Madeleine. And thank you, Tyler. This is really a wonderful book, and I am glad to have had the chance to read it and to have the chance to engage with you to discuss it a little bit. When Shani asked me to be on the panel, of course, knowing you and having collaborated with you over the years, I thought Tyler writing a transatlantic history that's thinking about France in connection to the US, I have to be in this conversation. So thank you for the book. It is, just to echo what Bob has already said, an exemplary synoptic history is the way I describe it. It has the breadth to encompass everything from Enlightenment philosophy to contemporary politics, and it also covers a remarkable range of objects of study, from social history in the broadest strokes to fine analysis of lieux de mémoire, like the Statue of Liberty, or opera, The Magic Flute, or literature, Peter Pan, Treasure Island. But there's also a real urgency that I would underline in the work. And in that sense, it's reminiscent of, just to name a couple of the recent books that I think it's in the neighborhood of, Carol Anderson's White Rage, or Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. There's a real purchase and exigency to the analysis here that's not simply an abstract or empty historical reading, but it is very much, it's a book that speaks to the moment. So I commend you for it, and I thank you for it. I am going to just offer a couple of comments, and some overlap with what Bob has already said, but really a couple of comments that are meant to open up our discussion and questions that will hopefully provoke you to speak a bit further about what you've laid out already. Like Bob, I'll just repeat it quickly. I won't go into as much detail because he's already said it. When you say toward the end of the book, this is a work of history, certainly not one of contemporary political analysis, and most definitely not an attempt to predict the future. I try to respect that, but I find it, like Bob, almost impossible to avoid asking the presentist question, right? The implications of the project for our understanding of the current conjuncture. When you say it toward the end of the book again, the Voting Rights Act, talking about the Cold War era and the Civil Rights movement, with the Voting Rights Act, the second Reconstruction triumphed, but how complete the triumph was and whether one day a third Reconstruction would be necessary remained to be seen, you write. In the moment, I mean, this week, this month, of a startlingly brazen restriction of voting rights in state after state across the South, what does your book have to tell us? And I think Bob has already said that, but just to restate it quickly, I would like to hear what you'd have to say. And then two other areas I want to point you to, and hopefully there'll be time to explore them a little bit. One, I wanted to push you a bit and think through the implications of the global scope of the project. You say some interesting things about it at the beginning, that it's global in scope, the book, but you say in a kind of caveat that white freedom is situated somewhere between comparative and world history, is the way you phrase it. And of course, the comparison, the fascinating parallels between France and the United States, there's a powerful logic to the parallels and the way you move across the Atlantic through those two case studies. But what I wonder about, and what I would like to hear you think about a little further, is to what extent is this a truly global phenomenon? To what extent is white freedom truly a global phenomenon? One way to think about it would be to think about the gaps. They're intriguing. Latin America is interestingly, it's not that it doesn't appear, you mentioned it a few times, but it's interestingly receded or tacit in the book. The imperial history in Latin America is starkly different in terms of its temporality. The national liberation movements have somewhat different trajectories than the ones you tend to focus on in Africa and Asia. The modes of the racialization of liberal democratic politics seem different as well in interesting ways. Race is clearly present in Latin America, and certainly it's a matter of Blackness, above all in the countries most directly impacted by the transatlantic slave trade. So Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador. One thing I'd say, if we try to take Latin America into consideration, is the Latin American case may demonstrate that the question of indigeneity is equally crucial in the constitution of national sovereignty and the implementation of liberal democracy in the way you're trying to analyze. It's not only race, but it's also indigeneity. And indigeneity is also a global issue. It's not just an American hemispheric issue, but it's also a global issue in relation to the deep historical patterns of population movement. You know, there's a politics of indigeneity in Scandinavia, or in South Asia, or in Southeast India with the Montagnards in Vietnam. Indigeneity is also a construct that travels. Another way to think about the comparative or world aspects of the project is to ask, let me put it as bluntly as possible, is white freedom ever only a national issue? Aren't the shifting dynamics of empire and immigration integral to the very process through which freedom and over time the governmental institutions of liberal democracy are managed? And I could run through all of your examples, I think. Third Republic, France, the conundrum that it's during the epoch of the Third Republic that colonial expansion takes off, or the era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow in the US. That's also the era of imperialism in the Caribbean and in the Philippines, and also the era in the US of immigration restriction with the Chinese Exclusion Act. These pairings you see over and over again in your case studies, and they are all pairings that are not just nation state specific, but are about transnational dynamics. In that sense, not only is white freedom, I think you're arguing, not ever a national issue in the sense of being conscribed only to one particular national conjuncture, but the term of and the problematic of imperialism is as central to the analysis as any other term. It's not in your title, but your book is about imperialism. When you get to, this goes by quickly, but in talking about World War II, and you mentioned Japan as an example, and say Japan's war effort, especially against China, was motivated by its own racial prejudices. Japan certainly had its own colonies, notably Korea and Taiwan, but nonetheless saw itself as a force for Asian racial deliverance and freedom. Similar kind of doublet, this conjuncture, this double bind. There, it's not a matter of, I think, a conjoining of freedom and whiteness. It is racialization in the way Japan figures, imperial Japan figures Korean otherness, but what's being constructed is not whiteness. One could even go so far as to argue that imperialism, the sense of an expansive and voracious national sovereignty, is even more central than whiteness in defining the racialization of freedom. And that may be going too far, but I wondered what you'd have to say about it in thinking toward the global implications of the project. And then one more thing I have a couple of other things, but I'll just throw one more out for now. To go back to something Bob said, but to take it from a different angle. And it's really to ask the same question he was asking at the end from the perspective of temporal primacy. Again, I'll put it as bluntly as I can. Is the Black freedom movement inherently reactive and thereby unavoidably derivative? It's in chapter 6 when you're talking about decolonization in the global South and the civil rights movement in the US. And Bob quoted this sentence, "Peoples of color have had to fight for inclusion into the idea of freedom." Right? In fact, not just struggling to be part of white freedom, but to overthrow it as a concept and as a social and political reality. Bob was talking about that concept, social and political reality relationship. What I would throw out as a secondary question is the proposition there that the idea of freedom is an already existing idea of freedom that one confronts and attempts to inject oneself into or reject and reframe. Is there a Black freedom movement that is autonomous, that's independent of the tradition of thinking liberty that you trace from the Enlightenment forward? Obviously here I'm thinking about the tradition in Black studies of the work of people like Cedric Robinson that I think defines Black autonomy as separate from, even if it's, he says, in the midst of, but not defined by the cauldron of Western modernity. But I'm also thinking of literary examples. It made me, reading your book, made me think back to George Lamming's Season of Adventure, the novel. And there's a moment when the fictional nation state achieves independence. One character says there, I think it was a real freedom when the tourist army went away. It was a real freedom they gave San Cristobal, the name of this fictional nation state. And the other character says, free is free, and it don't have no given. Free is how you is from the start. And when it look different, you got to move, just move. And when you're moving, say that is natural freedom, make you move. You can't move to freedom, because freedom is what you is and where you start and where you always got to stand. I put it to you, suppose your little boy come up one day and say, "Pa, you free to call me son." What you gonna say? Is there a Black thought and practice of freedom, a Black freedom movement that pre-exists and is autonomous from the Western tradition of a racialized thought and practice of freedom that you outline in the book? I'll stop there. I have more to say, but that's enough to start the conversation. Thank you again.
Tyler.
Okay. Well, thank you both for these really interesting comments and these really interesting insights. It does a historian good to hear from people that are not in my field and are bringing different approaches to it. I'm going to actually start and I'm going against everything I believe as a historian because they always go from the past to the present. So I'm going to start with Brent Hayes Edwards' last comment about the idea of, is there another kind of freedom that for Blacks that is in effect autonomous, that is independent of more general Western prescriptions of freedom? And while you were saying that, Brent, I was thinking about the fact that we are currently engaged in celebrating, or commemorating rather, the centennial of the destruction of Black Tulsa in 1921. And I thought about that because the creation of that community, which is known as the Black Wall Street, was in many ways one of the ultimate symbols of something that happened with the end of the Civil War, of Black people trying to create their own communities throughout the country, traveling throughout the country. There's a whole history of like Black towns that were created by ex-slaves throughout the country, some which survived, many which did not. But the idea was not so much that we're going to fit into a certain narrative of freedom, but we're just going to go out and find our own lives. And this is something that you see, of course, not just in the United States. The novel Texaco, for example, which is set in Martinique, is exactly about that, creating this the struggle in post-emancipation society to create these kinds of communities and structure your own life. And it's a fascinating ideal about how you how you can conceive of an idea of freedom that's beyond strictures. Let me take another very, very different example, which is there was a novel by a German author, Stefan Heim, called Schwarzenberg, which is set in 1945 and posits the idea that there's this little community part of Germany that's missed by both the Soviet and the American armies. And therefore the people are free to create their own reality, another vision of freedom. So I think you get those kinds of ideas, and that is a different expression of freedom. But I think one of the things I'm arguing in my book is that it's precisely those kinds of ideas of freedom that have to be suppressed. I mean, that's why I started out with Pirates and Children, because those are also people's groups that in different kinds of ways represent this kind of autonomous vision of freedom, that there are many different kinds of freedom and many possibilities of conceiving of freedom, but white freedom goes along with a certain constricted idea that has to be structured, it has to be defended, so other visions of it have to be suppressed. Let me also then go to the presentist arguments or the presentist concerns about this. You know, my book came out 2 weeks after the January 6th invasion of the Capitol building. And my reactions are, first of all, horrified. Secondly, boy, this is great publicity. But also the idea that, well, looking at this crowd of mostly white people invading the US Capitol building, be allowed to simply depart on their own without anybody telling them to stop or anything. I remember thinking to myself, if this doesn't show that freedom isn't white in America, I don't know what does, right? So these are still very, very alive issues today. The issue of voter suppression has a direct tie to Jim Crow. But of course, Jim Crow was in effect the attempt to continue slavery, in effect, to continue the disempowerment of Black people. So the fact that you have an overwhelmingly white Republican Party now engaged in that speaks to the idea that, you know, the struggle for white freedom is certainly by no means, and remember, this is again led by the House Freedom Caucus, is certainly by no means over. But I think to go back a bit farther, part of what I do in chapter 6 is talk about, it's called the fall and rise of white freedom. I look at the period after the 1970s. I was a student in Boston during the whole busing movement. I can remember what that kind of racism was like. It was something I had to confront personally when it came choice as to whether or not to vote for Joe Biden for president, because Joe Biden, to a large extent, made his reputation politically by supporting the anti-busing movement in the 1970s and 1980s, and had a key role in ensuring, in effect, the continued segregation of American schools. So these are issues that are very much alive to this day. And I think if my book can make a contribution in this respect, it is to show the ways in which these kinds of issues, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to write about voter suppression because it was a bit too new for me to address, but can show the ways in which these movements have a long, long history. That it is not just the idea that, well, oh, the election was not respectable. It is part of a long history to suppress the votes of certain people as a way of preserving a certain vision of freedom and a certain vision of history. Let me go back to Bob's questions. So the question, did I intend to use this approach to sketch a method for consideration of concepts other than freedom? It's a very interesting question. And let me just answer by saying that above all, in conceptualizing this book, I was really interested in the whole idea of challenging the notion of contradiction, challenging the idea that these two fundamentally opposed practices or ideas could exist without there being some kind of inner unity to them. I think that's an approach that perhaps can apply to other issues in terms of contemporary thought, in terms of contemporary life. There's also the question, I think Brent's question of, is white freedom ever non-national? You brought up the question of World War II Japan. Whiteness is not necessarily the only kind of racialized freedom. You can have racialized freedom. In the Japanese case, Imperial Japan tried to make an effort for an Asian type of freedom that was that way, and to use that as a way of both pulling together an empire in Asia for itself, and also defying Europe and America as white powers. There was a challenge with that, of course, and it was in some ways the same challenge that Napoleon faced in his conquest of Europe in the early 19th century. If you bring in the idea of freedom, which is based on the suppression of local populations, this is not going to be very persuasive over the long run. And that's what happened in World War II Asia, just as it happened in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. And then finally, the question of Latin America. Let me say from the get-go that it is very hard to be a world historian and be completely a historian of the entire world. And in fact, one of the things that I think a field like world history calls for is ultimately, and this is going to be very hard for historians and most academics, going beyond let me say historians, going beyond the idea of the individual scholar. And I wanted to bring that back to historians and perhaps humanists, because of course scientists have no problem at all with doing collaborative research, working in teams or labs or things like that. There is no reason why, for example, you could not have a world history that is written by several different people, one of whom specializes in Latin America, one of whom specializes in the Mediterranean, so on and so forth. The fact that that is not done, almost never to my knowledge, is both a challenge to the historical profession and a challenge to the humanities in terms of ultimately really being able to address some of these questions as fully as possible. No, the question of Latin America is really fascinating because it is a racialized history, absolutely. It is racialized in a different kind of way. And had I more knowledge, I would have loved to engage in it, but there's only so much time in the day and there's only so much knowledge, and I figured I should go with what I knew. But I think raising it is a good point, and it's something that should be considered for people going forth in this regard.
Thanks, Tyler. I know that Brent and Bob have more questions, but perhaps we'll hold off on those for a moment and go to some of the questions that have started to appear in the Q&A. And of course, I want to invite people to drop their questions or comments in the Q&A if you have some. So let me, we'll say first that there are several people, Irene Almeida and Marcel Nzioku, asking you to say more about notions of Black freedom, but I think you already spoke to that a little bit in your response to Brent, but maybe you want to come back to it.
Sure.
Emmanuel Caton would like you to say more about how Enlightenment philosophers, he mentions Rousseau and Kant, conceive of freedom, and do they think of freedom as white freedom? Could that be said?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, let me address that. I think that it's not so much that they as individuals think of freedom as white freedom, but they very much are part of this whole emphasis on this sort of great chain of being of racial hierarchies, which look at different peoples and the different qualities they have and the different sort of potentials they have. I mean, one of the things about the Enlightenment I was always taught was that it was really in effect an attempt to try and apply the methodology of the scientific revolution to the study of humanity. right? And so it was an attempt to be as rigorous as possible in terms of classifying different human populations. And I think to that extent, yes, certainly Kant and Rousseau, for example, did buy into this idea that some people are more civilized or more sort of intellectually adept than others. And I think along with that went an idea of freedom. Now, it's interesting because, of course, this is also the culture that produces or fosters the whole idea of the noble savage, right? Of the idea that some people are free naturally, but that is ultimately not freedom in the same kind of way. And I would argue, even in the 18th century, there is a belief that this kind of freedom is ultimately, I don't want to say bad, but ultimately non-productive and ultimately not part of human progress, that it has to be suppressed. And so I would say in that sense, yes, they did.
Can I press you on that a little bit?
Sure.
I was interested in a moment in the book in which you try to explain how it is that there is such a prevalent, especially towards the end of the 18th century, metaphor of, metaphorical use of slavery, to speak about despotism and authority in all kinds of terms, but not particularly to resist or oppose actual slavery happening in the colonial world. And you ask why that is, why you have this metaphor, but it's not really actualized as a reference to the colonial world. And you suggest that it is because of this underlying, racializing ideology, the way that people are looking at different groups in the world. And I think that's true, but it's also I think it's also true that you don't see that connection being made tightly in philosophical works. You have to, you kind of have to pick and choose and put things together. And you also consider another argument that has to do with investment, capitalism, and so forth. And that seems to be less significant in your mind than racialization. And I just wonder, maybe this is going a little bit down kind of Eric Williams territory, but how you would connect capitalism, commodification to to these racial ideologies circulating in Enlightenment texts.
Okay, well, let me answer that in a couple of ways. First, let's go back to the whole issue of the slave metaphor, because the slave metaphor pops up in a lot of different places, and oftentimes in places where you wouldn't expect it. Places where you have slave owners talking about being enslaved, for example. I mean, one of the interesting things about the US Civil War is that it wasn't the North that talked about it, it was a war for freedom. It was the South that talked about it as a war for freedom, at least initially. Partly because this is before the North had embraced the idea of abolitionism, but also there was a sense that, owning property, to be free meant to own property. And that included property that consisted of human beings. One of the things I'm really interested in, and this is, I talk about this in the book more in the 19th century, but it has roots in the 18th century as well, is the whole origins, conceptual origins of the idea of liberal democracy. Because what interests me about liberal democracy is the idea that so many people think of it today as a sort of a natural phenomenon, and fail to see that, in fact, it's a contradiction in terms. That liberty and democracy were in many ways very much opposed, that one emphasized the powers of the individual, one emphasized the prerogatives of the mass. And in particular, it's something that had to develop because you had to have a society that emphasized democracy, but one that did not threaten property rights. Because the problem was, if you had a majority of the population that did not have property, what was to stop them from voting to expropriate the property of those that did? I mean, this is still, in effect, the heart of the Republican Party argument against taxation, for example. So it seemed to me that the whole emphasis on freedom had to be twinned with a focus on the idea of freedom not for everybody. In other words, that certain populations, those that did not have property, ultimately those that were property, could not be permitted to threaten the property of those that did have it, and that was defined increasingly in racial terms by the 19th century.
Thanks. So there are several questions in the Q&A that have to do with indigeneity. So Andona Day asks if you could return to Brent's question about how the concept of indigeneity and the presence of Native peoples and what is now called the United States would intersect with your argument about white freedom.
Okay, thank you for doing that, because I meant to address that question by from Brent, which was really a fascinating one. It's also interesting because, of course, the symbol of the Native in American popular culture is often itself taken as a symbol of freedom, right? That you have people that, one of the sort of things that popular genealogists talk about is all the Americans that say that they have Native ancestry, whether they actually do or not. So in other words, it's a very positive symbol for many Americans. That, of course, does not sort of trump the fact that the treatment of indigenous people, both historically and to the present day, has been anything but positive. So I think that here again, I mean, one of the other groups you have, of course, in Peter Pan is Native Americans, right? That's another group that's seen as part of this universe that represents a certain kind of freedom, but ultimately a freedom that is not sustainable, that has to be suppressed. There is the idea of indigenous people. I mean, for example, there's a reason why I think, for example, when Americans think of Native peoples, they mostly think of Plains Indians, for example. The idea of Native peoples living on a wide expanse, rather than people with farms and settled communities, which was the case of many Native peoples, especially in the East, because it's the image of the sort of Native American on his horse riding free across the plains that really fits the idea of the Native as free, right? Which is a very cherished image. And yet at the same time, it is an image that does not fit with the society that white Americans are developing, and ultimately has to be suppressed. So I see indigeneity, as sort of fitting into the whole idea of what I called savage freedom in my first chapter, is a kind of freedom that is very much prized to this day, in theory, but in reality cannot exist along with white freedom. And it represents an alternative to it, and something that ultimately a challenge to it.
So another kind of freedom that comes up in a question from Michael O'Connor is religious freedom. So many groups that settled in this country sought religious freedom. That was also a strain in the French Revolution. Yeah. What are the differences between ideas of religious freedom and racial freedom? Is the question.
Okay. I would say the thing about religious freedom, and I'm thinking mostly of Christian ideas of freedom, although not exclusively, is that ultimately they argue that man is not free at all. Man is the subject of God, right? It may be free from other human beings, but freedom consists in obeying, ultimately, the will of God, and being a part of communities that also are built around obeying the will of God. I talked about contradictions. One of the contradictions that's dear to American historians is the history of the Puritans, who fought for religious freedom and left their homeland for religious freedom, only to arrive in New England and to be far more sort of intolerant of any kind of religious dissent than their experience in England itself. I posed this once to a historian of early modern America, and she said the point about the Puritans was that they didn't believe in tolerance. They believed that they were right and everybody else was wrong. And they should be supported precisely because they were right, not because of any belief in religious tolerance. So I think in many cases, the idea of religious freedom is frankly not an idea of freedom at all. It's an idea, certainly in Christianity. Now in other religions, that's not nearly as true, perhaps. But certainly in Christianity, there's the idea that, you're a servant of God and you're bound to the will of God. And that your life should be organized around that. And it's not about your own individual desires. It's about how you can serve the will of God. So
I realize we don't have very much time. I wanted to take a couple more questions from the Q&A and then come back to Brent and Bob for last questions or thoughts, and to you too, Tyler. So I think there's an important question from Bohdan Orishkovich about the connection between white freedom and Black incarceration. Is incarceration a tool of white freedom? Does white freedom need Black incarceration? And a question from Althea Nelson. If you have something to say about America spreading its freedom abroad. So the war in Afghanistan being known as Operation Enduring Freedom, for example.
Okay. Well, on the first point, absolutely. I mean, incarceration was in effect one of the major means of preserving slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. The rise of the chain gang was in effect a way of preserving slavery in the South, just as was the disenfranchisement of African Americans. So these were ways in which, and these are things that have lasted down in many ways to the present day. When you look at this racial statistics of imprisonment, which are heavily weighted in terms of Blacks and Black men in particular, you see simply another version of this idea that Blacks cannot be free. And imprisonment is a kind of, a permissible way of stripping citizens of their freedom. And it tends to be very racialized. Now, the other question, I'm sorry, what was the other question again?
It was about the United States abroad,
spreading freedom abroad.
Spreading freedom through war.
Right. Well, the sort of contradictions are pretty salient with that. It's sort of like the doctor saying we had to kill that patient in order to save it. We had to destroy that village in order to save it. Ultimately, it speaks to an idea that, Americans have this ideal of freedom that is really trumps what other people practice and what other people believe in. And that the idea that freedom can be imposed is, first of all, a very problematic idea in and of itself. But it also, of course, when you scratch below the surface of such an argument, oftentimes you find other motivations aside from spreading freedom that motivate American intervention. And then let me finally answer that in terms of American intervention as a way of preserving America's own freedom. Even if you're not concerned about the freedom of others, is America invading countries to prevent itself from losing freedom? Given the sort of geopolitical position of the United States, the idea that America is going to be overcome by another nation and deprived of its freedom anytime soon is sort of a hard one to envisage. So, but I think that lies at the heart of many ideas of spreading freedom abroad, so to speak, spreading it abroad to preserve it at home.
Great. Let me come back to Bob and Brent for final questions or thoughts. Bob?
Oh, I don't know that I have a final question so much as I suppose what I'm still pondering Brent's line of questioning relating to the concept of freedom, whether it needs to be reactive. The question he posed with reference to Cedric Robinson, and I think that's a really, really interesting question to think hard about. I think it's a hard question, just because behind it is another question, I think, which is what is it that makes an alternate, conception of freedom, or an alternate concept of freedom, or an alternate vision of freedom, say an alternate vision of freedom, as opposed to, say, just an alternate vision. So even if you're going to, go the route of, non-reactivity and say, well, there's something, there are concepts of freedom operative in the Black radical tradition that can be defined without reference. That can somehow be defined without reference to concepts of freedom operative in Western civilization, broadly speaking. If one's going to say that, to the extent one wants to talk about both concepts as concepts of freedom, presumably one has in mind that there's something that they both share in common, such that they both count as concepts of freedom as opposed, or visions of freedom, as opposed to just on the Black radical tradition side, just a different vision. Something else is going on that maybe just doesn't have to do with freedom. So that's a hard, that's a deep and hard question. It's a great question, but a hard one to answer, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's not my question. It's just a riff on Brent's question.
Sure. Yeah.
You want me to say some more things, Madeleine? There's too much to say. There's not enough time, but I can say a couple of things very quickly. Some riffing on what Bob was just saying. I mean, a couple of quick points. I agree, Tyler, with what you're saying in terms of the category of savage freedoms, and that some of the alternatives that we were outlining are somewhat similar in that space as modalities of freedom that have to be quelched or controlled. But it does seem to me that there's a qualitative difference, that childhood is a developmental stage that then become metaphorized, can take on significance or be made to take on significance. Piracy is parasitical in relation to commerce, in relation to capitalism. And what we were talking about as alternatives are existing functioning social formations, life worlds and communal modes of being that, to me, yes, also have to be crushed, but they're a different kind of threat than the threat of the figure of the child or the figure of the pirate. And I would hold on to that. Indigeneity is also, it's connected to this. Indigeneity, it's an issue of who owns the land, who was there first, who has the right to be there, and are there other models of community formation and relating to the land than territorial sovereignty, owning the land? Can you relate to the land in a different way? So indigeneity starts to open up all these different questions that, again, take you in the direction of alternatives. And the last thing I'll say is I don't know why the book does not, is very dissimilar from Black Marxism. It's not like or even touching on many of the same things as Black Marxism. But for some reason, I really had Cedric Robinson in my mind as I was reading your book. And that was another of my big questions. Aren't you really, and I was thinking of, for you, as someone who wrote his first book, you are a labor historian. You wrote your first book on unions in France, you know. Aren't you telling the history of capitalism? And aren't you basically making the point that Cedric Robinson makes in Black Marxism, that the history of capitalism is the history of racial capitalism? How many of your examples are about not just the right to vote, not just the definition of freedom, but defining the right to vote in relation to property? And property, it's not just owning stuff, it's property in relation to capitalist accumulation, right? Capitalism works through race, or you could think it through Black British cultural studies, Stuart Hall, race is the modality through which classes lived. Race is always there, but what you're telling us is the history of capitalist expropriation, and then its relation to racism and imperialism and these other realms that we're moving into. But on some level, I think that you're giving us an interesting retelling of that old story of the history of capitalism.
Well, let me just respond really quickly because I know we're out of time. Absolutely. I mean, the whole issue of property is key here, but let me go back to the issue of the land in particular, because part of the image of indigenous people in the land is that they do not have a proprietary relationship to the land. They are free, in effect, of the problems of ownership, right? That their relationship is very different, and that's what has to be suppressed. And I thought I might be able to get away without doing this, but I find I can't. You know, the ultimate saying about freedom is Janis Joplin's, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose, right? There's ways in which commodities represent freedom and also deprive us of freedom at the same time. And I think in looking at the racialized nature of freedom, especially in a modern world where one of the greatest examples of freedom was of property was human property, slaves as property. I mean, American historians are still looking at the ways in which that lay at the basis of American capitalism and other societies as well. So that's another aspect of the whole issue of freedom that I think is really important, that capitalism is defined as a kind of freedom, but it also in many ways has to suppress freedom in order to survive. I mean, if you did not have the suppression of the freedom of African slaves, capitalism would be a shadow of itself in the United States today, for example. So.
Okay, well, I think unfortunately we have to leave things there. I feel that we've only skimmed the surface of your book, Tyler, but in a way that's good, because then I can encourage everyone to go and buy it. And I believe that you can get a 30% discount if you purchase the book from Princeton via the this webinar, I think the announcement contains an explanation of how to do that. So thank you so much for the book and for being here for this conversation. And thanks also to Brent and Bob for great and thought-provoking questions, and to everyone who attended and who also asked really important questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
thanks
you,
everybody.
Madeleine.
That was great.
Thank you. Okay.
Take care.
Take care.